The year was 1911, and the dense, humid air of East Texas carried with it an unsettling stillness that seemed to press against the wooden walls of a farmhouse just outside Beaumont. Life in the Whitaker household had always been quiet, routine, and unremarkable until the nights began to change. One evening, young Samuel Whitaker, no older than 8, whispered to his parents that his bed spoke to him. The words were low, rasping, and utterly incomprehensible, coming from the slats and posts of a simple pine bed. At first, his parents dismissed it as imagination, a child's fanciful tale. But whispers did not stop, and soon the child's fear became contagious, seeping into the minds of his siblings, who began to describe the same chilling encounters. Within weeks, the household was gripped by a series of unexplained illnesses. Fevers came and went, rashes appeared where there should have been none, and 2 children were discovered lifeless in their rooms, faces frozen in expressions of unspoken terror. Physicians from the nearest town could offer no plausible explanation, citing mysterious respiratory failures and sudden collapses. Yet the family, stricken with grief and suspicion, insisted that something far darker had taken root within the very walls of their home. Neighbors corroborated strange phenomena, whispers that seemed to echo through the wooden beams, shadows that shifted without source, and the faint impression of eyes watching from corners of rooms that had no light. The farmhouse, ordinary by daylight, had become a vessel of terror by night. Its creaking floors, warped panels, and simple furniture, most notably the bed in which the children slept, transformed into agents of dread. Scholars would later debate whether this was the product of a collective psychological breakdown, the acoustic oddities of aged timber, or something that defied human understanding. Folklore began to take root even before investigators arrived, and whispers of curses, restless spirits, and ancestral sins traveled faster than the facts could keep pace. What is most chilling, perhaps, is the interplay between the ordinary and the horrific. A child's bed, a common object of comfort and sleep, became a conduit of fear, blurring the lines between imagination and reality, innocence and malevolence, the human mind and forces beyond comprehension. The stage was set for tragedy, and every reader or listener is left to wonder, when is the mind a witness to unseen horrors, and when are those horrors real? Was this the first sign of something that would consume an entire family, or simply the unraveling of fragile psyches in isolation? The answer remains elusive, and that very uncertainty will haunt the story from its first whispered word to the final, unresolved question. The Whitaker family had long been a fixture of the Beaumont countryside, hard-working cotton farmers whose days were defined by sun and soil, sweat and labor. Life was quiet, predictable, and outwardly simple, a rhythm dictated by the seasons, the harvest, and the demands of raising children in a modest wooden farmhouse that had stood for nearly a generation. At first glance, nothing about the Whitakers suggested they would ever be caught in the grip of a tale that would haunt the annals of East Texas for decades. But appearances, as history would later reveal, were deceptive. Behind closed doors, the house carried whispers of tension, grief, and an unspoken anxiety that seemed to coil like smoke in the corners of every room. The farmhouse itself, though modest and unassuming, possessed an almost sentient character. Its floors creaked under the lightest step, as if reminding occupants that every movement would be heard, recorded, remembered. The timber beams, warped with age and the relentless heat of the Texas sun, groaned in ways that some would later interpret as more than the natural settling of a house. Even the wind seemed to whisper as it passed through cracked window panes and around the eaves, bending into the hollow spaces of the attic where shadows pooled like ink. Every night, the house seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of expectation, an unnameable tension that no visitor could ignore. Historical records describe the house in utilitarian terms: 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a parlor, and a batporch overlooking the fields. But the private diaries and journals of the Whitaker children and their parents paint A different picture, a picture of a household heavy with sorrow and undercurrents of fear. The death of an infant years prior, a near drowning in the irrigation canal, and repeated losses of livestock to disease all seemed to conspire to creation atmosphere in which the imagination could flourish unchecked. The children often wrote of eyes in the walls, of sounds that seemed to breathe in rhythm with their own, and of voices too low and sharp to be human. These entries, at first dismissed by parents as fanciful inventions, would later assume a darker significance. The family's daily life was regimented, driven by necessity, but marked with a rigidity that some interpreted as the early signs of paranoia. Meals were punctual, chores were exacting, and the parents maintained a discipline that bordered on authoritarian. Scholars examining these accounts suggest that the children's fear may have been intensified not only by real events, but also by an environment in which control was strict and personal expression limited. The innocence of youth, so easily bent by circumstance, collided with a growing awareness that something in the household, or perhaps in the house itself, was shifting, evolving in ways beyond comprehension. Adding to this tension was the folklore that had long clung to the land in which the Whitaker farm sat. Local legend spoke of a cursed ground, a tract of soil once frequented by traveling preachers who performed violent exorcisms and rites meant to drive away spirits or, as some accounts suggested, to summon them. According to whispered tales, the very trees used to build the farmhouse were taken from these consecrated and profaned groves, their timber imbued with residual energy, or, as rumor held, with the memory of blood spilled beneath their roots. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of beams that seemed to weep, of boards that whispered when a wind blew. While these accounts were dismissed by some as superstition, they gained traction among neighbors and clergy alike, lending an unshakable sense of foreboding to the environment that the family inhabited. The bed where the children slept became the focal point of this unease. Crafted from solid oak taken from one of the older groves, it was said by travelers and folk storytellers to have drunk blood in its early life, carved from timber that absorbed the stories of ritual and sacrifice. Every joint and slat was etched with ornate patterns that, under dim light, seemed to shift and writhe. The children themselves described the feeling of being observed while lying beneath its carved frame, and they began to speak in fragmented, anxious whispers of voices that moved with the rhythm of the wind. Was this the natural cracking of wood responding to the night's temperature? Or something else, something that had begun to take residence within the fabric of the household? Church leaders from nearby Beaumont weighed in on these events, interpreting the growing unease as a possible sign of divine punishment. Reverend Elias Crow, a man known for his fervent belief in spiritual retribution, suggested that the family might be targeted due to hidden sins or failures in moral duty. In contrast, skeptical neighbors and visiting physicians proposed mundane explanations: poor ventilation, mold that could induce hallucinations, or stress-induced paranoia brought on by isolation and repeated familial losses. The tension between these interpretations, between moral judgment, environmental factors, and psychological fragility, created a fertile ground for the whispers to grow louder, for fear to become palpable, and for the extraordinary to emerge from the ordinary. Even routine objects took on an ominous significance. The creaking floors seemed to echo the children's footsteps back to them in exaggerated, distorted rhythms. The warped walls appeared to lean inward at night, as if narrowing the space and compressing the household into a claustrophobic stage set for terror. Every gust of wind rattled windows in patterns that suggested whispers, and the faint groan of the settling house was interpreted as sighs of warning or displeasure. Over time, the children began to perceive the house itself as a living entity, its attention focused squarely upon them. Their diaries reflect a growing obsession with corners and shadows, with spaces where light failed to reach, and with a feeling of presence that could not be attributed to human companions. Amid all this, the innocence of the children contrasted sharply with the weight of the narratives forming around them. Where the parents saw playful imagination, the children reaped sustained terror. Where the community saw superstition, the family experienced something immediate, visceral, and inescapable. Even the simplest acts, climbing into bed, closing eyes to sleep, became fraught with anxiety and suspicion. Objects in the room were no longer inert. The bed, the floorboards, the walls themselves became characters in an unfolding drama that no one could fully comprehend. The combination of environmental strain, personal loss, psychological tension, and folkloric resonance created a perfect storm. By the time the first night of tragedy arrived, the stage was set, a household primed to interpret ordinary stimuli as malevolent, and a land steeped in stories of ritual and curse. The Whitakers' farmhouse had become more than a home. It had become a crucible of fear, a place where history, memory, and imagination converged to create the conditions for horror. The ordinary wooden beams and simple furniture bore silent witness to the anxieties that had taken root, while the children's perceptions transformed these everyday objects into instruments of dread. This convergence of human and environmental factors would shape the events to follow, making the first recorded tragedies not merely accidents, but seemingly inevitable manifestations of a deeper, more inescapable terror. Late in the spring of 1911, the Whitaker farmhouse, long quiet except for the hum of cicadas and the occasional groan off settling timber, became the site of its first recorded tragedy. 8-year-old Samuel Whitaker, a boy described by neighbors as curious, gentle, and sensitive to the moods of his family, was discovered lifeless in his bed one morning. His mother, Martha Whitaker, had entered his room at dawn to awaken him for chores and found him cold, pale, and unmoving, his small body rigid as though frozen mid-breath. His eyes, wide open and glassy, seemed to hold a look off-drawer that no one could fully interpret. The family was overcome with grief, unable to comprehend the suddenness of the event. Physicians from Beaumont were summoned, examining Samuel with meticulous attention, yet finding no immediate cause of death. Their records indicated sudden respiratory failure, a rare condition, but one that could strike otherwise healthy children without warning. But the Whitakers' private accounts told a different story. Samuel had spoken of the bed whispering to him for weeks, of voices that called his name when no one was present. In letters sent to relatives and friends, Martha described hearing her son respond to unseen commands, murmuring in language unfamiliar to anyone in the household. Even more disturbing were Samuel's own scrawled notes, later preserved in diaries and journals, describing the bed as moving beneath me and breathing like someone else was there. Outsiders. These may have seemed like a child's fevered imagination or the product of trauma, yet within the family, the fear was palpable and immediate. In the days that followed, neighbors began reporting unusual phenomena. Lights in the farmhouse flickered in the dead of night. Shadows moved along walls and floors where no candle burned, often coinciding with the family's description of Samuel speaking to unseen entities. Some claimed to have heard faint, distorted voices, low and rasping, echoing through the timber-bird hallways. Others insisted that the bed itself seemed to vibrate, responding to Samuel's presence as though alive. These accounts, fragmented and inconsistent, painted a picture that straddled the line between documented reality and folklore. Within weeks, the household was struck by another tragedy. Clara Whitaker, Samuel's younger sister, no more than 5 years old, was found unresponsive in the very same bed. The circumstances mirrored those of her brother's death, with her small frame rigid, her face frozen in a silent scream. Doctors again diagnosed sudden respiratory collapse, though no physical evidence supported an explanation beyond the inexplicable. Friends and family observed that Clara had been increasingly anxious in the nights preceding her death, whispering of shadows that watched from the corners and a bed that moved when I tried to sleep. Some journals suggested the children may have shared a form of contagion fear, manifesting in psychosomatic symptoms, but such hypotheses offered little comfort to the grieving household. The contrast between medical reports and personal testimony became a source of tension in the community. On one hand, physicians and inspectors insisted that the deaths were coincidental, the tragic intersection of rare illness and the fragility of young life. On the other, the family's letters, diaries, and spoken accounts insisted on the presence of something active, malevolent, and incomprehensible. The bed, an object designed for comfort, had become a locus of dread. Observers noted subtle movements in the wood, as if thievery frame had absorbed the children's terror and was responding in kind. Local artisans and craftsmen, when later shown sketches of the bed, remarked that the joints and slats were unusually tight, almost unnaturally so, and that in certain lighting, the carvings appeared to shift and writhe, creating the illusion of motion where none should exist. Religious authorities offered their own interpretations. Reverend Elias Crow, a traveling preacher who had occasionally visited the family, suggested that the children were victims of possession, that some unseen spiritual force had targeted them because of sins or failings within the household. Church leaders debated whether divine judgment had fallen upon family, or whether the events were a manifestation of lingering evil in the land itself, perhaps connected to older pre-Christian rites once performed in the area. Sermons from the period cautioning against sleeping in cursed spaces and the necessity of spiritual vigilance spread among local congregations, blending with whispers of the bed's dark history. Meanwhile, psychologists, or rather the precursors to modern behavioral scientists, began to speculate on the role of hysteria, trauma, and fear. Could the children have experienced a form of shared psychogenic disorder? Did the stress and anxiety accumulated over years of minor tragedies, accidents, and familial tension create a fertile environment for hallucinations or psychosomatic collapse? Some theorists suggested that the children, highly sensitive to the moods and tensions of the household, unconsciously manifested their anxiety in ways that proved fatal. While clinical reports offered these rational explanations, they struggled to account for the precise timing, the reported shadows, or the eerie synchronicity between the two deaths. Complicating the narrative further were local legends that began circulating almost immediately after the second death. Tales of cursed land, restless spirits, and malevolent objects spread beyond the farmhouse, intertwining with the known facts to create a myth that was difficult to separate from reality. Witnesses described seeing shadows stretch unnaturally along the walls, as though following an invisible choreography. Some insisted that the bed whispered commands, luring the children into unnatural stillness. Farmers and townspeople reported experiencing an oppressive weight when passing the house at night, as if the atmosphere itself carried the memory of death. Letters sent to distant relatives attempted to reconcile these conflicting narratives. The parents, Martha and Thomas Whitaker, alternately described fear of illness and fear of the supernatural, often in the same paragraph. They requested medical attention, but also called for spiritual guidance, leaving investigators uncertain whether the household believed themselves victims of physical ailment, malevolent forces, or both. Their anguish and confusion were reflected in diary entries where simple acts climbing into bed, closing eyes to sleep, walking down hallways were described as fraught with terror. Even the routine tasks of childhood had become arenas of anxiety, magnifying the sense of helplessness and heightening the family's isolation. Neighbors, too, reported incidents that blurred the line between reality and rumor. Windows rattled though no wind blew. Footsteps echoed along empty corridors. Some claimed that faint, childlike laughter could be heard in the dead of night, even when the house was sealed and the family absent. Observers sometimes swore they saw the figures of the children reflected in mirrors, even after their deaths, though skeptics dismissed these as grief-driven illusions. These contradictory accounts deepened the mystery and solidified Thebes' reputation as a vessel of terror. The deaths of Samuel and Clara Whitaker thus became more than personal tragedy. They evolved into a story that challenged the boundaries of reason, psychology, and faith. Medical records suggested ordinary, if unfortunate, causes. Family journals painted a picture of something extraordinary, terrifying, and inexplicable. Folklore, already alive in East Texas, seized upon the events and began to intertwine them with pre-existing tales of cursed land, restless spirits, and objects imbued with malevolence. The tension between fact and myth, between human frailty and perceived supernatural intervention, created an atmosphere of suspense and dread that would come to define the legend of the Whitaker farmhouse. Even today, the events of that spring linger in local memory. Scholars, folklorists, and psychologists debate the roles of coincidence, environment, trauma, and supernatural influence. No definitive answers have been found. The deaths of Samuel and Clara remain a chilling prelude to what followed, a dark foreshadowing that hints at forces both human and inexplicable, setting the stage for investigations, public fascination, and stories that refuse to fade with time. In this confluence of grief, fear, and mystery, the ordinary became horrifying, the home became haunted, and a simple bed, transformed into a monument of dread whose whispers, some say, are never fully silenced. In the aftermath of the Whitaker children's deaths, Beaumont and the surrounding countryside were abuzz with questions, fear, and speculation. The tragic events had drawn the attention of an unusual convergence of authorities. Local physicians, fire inspectors, and clergy all sought answers, each bringing their own framework of understanding to a situation that defied easy explanation. The farmhouse, once a place of routine domestic life, had become a locus of obsession. Those who entered were immediately confronted with the paradox of the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary. Simple bed, a creaking floorboard, and the shifting shadows of an old wooden house now charged with dread. Each expert, arriving with their own tools and assumptions, struggled to reconcile observed phenomena with accepted logic, and the tension between empirical evidence and superstition began to crystallize. Physicians from Beaumont, led by Dr. Horace Livingston, examined the physical environment of the Whitaker home meticulously. They scrutinized the air, the bedding, and the general condition of the house. Reports noted traces of mold in the corner of Samuel's room, poor ventilation, and evidence of dampness that could contribute to respiratory distress. Dr. Livingston suggested the possibility of an undiagnosed, hereditary condition or sleep-related suffocation. He considered rare forms of hypoventilation that could strike children with no prior symptoms. These theories, cold and precise, seemed to offer ascientific comfort, but they also left gaps. The synchronicity of the children's deaths, the repeated accounts of whispered words, and the family's insistence on supernatural presence could not be neatly explained by mold or hereditary anomalies. The physicians documented their findings with clinical detachment, yet even within these records, phrases like unexplained tremors and faint nocturnal sounds appeared, betraying the limits of reason. Fire inspectors were called to examine the Whitaker bed itself after reports of odd scorch marks and discoloration. Inspectors noted unusual burn patterns along the wooden slats marks that did not correspond to candle flames, lanterns, or any known sources of ignition. In certain areas, these marks appeared to form shapes, geometric designs that some described as symbols rather than the random damage one would expect from fire. While investigators attempted to attribute these phenomena to electrical sparks, friction, or chemical residues, their explanations felt unsatisfying. The bed had been used nightly without prior incident, yet now it seemed to bear the imprint of something intentional, almost ritualistic. Patterns of chair discoloration, the inspectors admitted, could not be fully explained by the mundane logic of fire and material science. Simultaneously, clergy descended upon the home, their intentions rooted in spiritual understanding rather than physical evidence. Reverend Elias Crow, an itinerant preacher with a reputation for confronting the supernatural, maintained meticulous diaries of his visits. Crow recorded attempts to exorcise unseen presences from the farmhouse, detailing nights when prayers seemed to provoke the very whispers he sought to banish. He described low, rasping voices that mocked scripture, shadows that twisted against the candlelight, and a palpable resistance in the bed itself to his ministrations. Crow's notes suggest a community willing to accept that evil might take physical form, or at the very least, that divine judgment could manifest through objects and places. The interplay between Crow's spiritual perspective and the scientific assessments created a palpable tension, one that mirrored the struggle in the minds of Theotakers themselves. Was the evil of their household a product of natural law, or of forces beyond comprehension? Thetone's folk, less constrained by formal investigation, leaned heavily toward superstition. Whispers circulated that the bed was cursed, an artifact imbued with the malevolence of ancestral sins. Some speculated that Samuel and Clara had been punished for familial transgressions, or that the land itself was spiritually tainted. Older residents recalled stories of traveling preachers who had performed violent rituals in the area decades prior, believing the land capable of absorbing human cruelty and broadcasting it through objects like wood, metal, or stone. Children's laughter or sobs, moving shadows, and unexplained sounds became evidence of lingering spiritual influence rather than misdiagnosis. Within these oral traditions, the bed itself was anthropomorphized, no longer a passive object. It was an agent with intent, capable of targeting, manipulating, and controlling those who slept upon it. The clash between rationality and superstition became more pronounced as investigators exchanged findings and opinions. Physicians insisted on environmental or physiological causes. Clergy and laypeople claimed evidence of possession or curse. Fire inspectors had him to locate natural causes for the scorch patterns, while families described recurring phenomena that seemed Tatafi fire science. Diaries, letters, and newspaper reports chronicled a growing debate. Was evil a product of circumstance, something inhering in material objects, or a manifestation of forces unseen? Moral philosophers would later frame these debates in terms of the age-old question: is evil innate, nurtured, or external? Some argued that the Whittaker children were victims of environment and heredity. Others claimed that the bed was a vessel for malevolent energies independent of human action. The psychological dimension deepened the unease. Experts suggested that collective fear could produce hallucinations or shared delusions. Trauma, grief, and the intense focus on whispered words could generate psychosomatic responses that manifested in fatal ways. Yet the specificity and consistency of accounts, Samuel and Clara describing shadows, whispers, and sensations simultaneously challenged the plausibility of mere hysteria. Was the mind alone capable of producing phenomena so detailed and coherent across multiple observers? The question lingered, unresolved, highlighting the limits of human understanding in the face of ambiguous experience. The supernatural interpretations, meanwhile, gained traction through journals, oral history, and the persuasive authority of clergy like Crow. Reports of whispering voices, shifting shadows, and a bed that resisted movement became canonical myths in the local folklore. Residents observed that nocturnal sounds seemed to respond to presence, that objects occasionally shifted position overnight, and that an oppressive energy could be felt by anyone entering the children's rooms. These observations, impossible to measure scientifically, nevertheless commanded attention. Scholars studying these accounts emphasize the tension inherent in human cognition, a desire to seek rational explanations while simultaneously acknowledging phenomena that defy empirical analysis. This tension extended into moral philosophy. Ifeville was environmental, then misfortune and tragedy were impersonal forces acting according to the laws of nature. Ifeville was inherited, then the Whittakers' lineage carried guilt beyond the individual, implicating ancestors in moral causality. If evil was external, a manifestation of forces beyond comprehension, Then human reason was inherently insufficient to navigate the unfolding horror. The interplay between these interpretations generated a sustained intellectual and emotional unease, compelling observers to consider their own assumptions about mortality, morality, and the limits of understanding. Over the months following the children's deaths, the Whitaker farmhouse became a site of continued observation, debate, and investigation. Physicians returned to monitor ventilation, chemical exposure, and the physical condition of surviving family members. Fire inspectors measured burn marks, chemical residues, and wood grain, attempting to detect natural patterns in what seemed to be deliberate or supernatural markings. Clergy conduct further exorcisms, documenting the persistence of whispers, shadows, and unexplainable movement. Meanwhile, townsfolk alternated between fear, fascination, and reverence, treating the house as both a warning and a locus of spiritual significance. Each new account, whether from a professional or a neighbor, reinforced the contradictions between observable fact and subjective experience. Ultimately, the events at the Whitaker farmhouse illustrate the tension between science and superstition, reason and fear, and the human need to explain phenomena that evade comprehension. The whispers, the shadows, and the scorched bed are at once concrete and elusive, presenting evidence that can be interpreted in multiple, mutually incompatible ways. Moral philosophy, psychological analysis, and folklore converge, producing an atmosphere of ambiguity that is both intellectually challenging and emotionally unsettling. The narrative teeters on the boundary of reality and myth, leaving unanswered questions that compel the observer to grapple with the limits of understanding. The unresolved contradictions set the stage for the next phase of the story, the first-hand accounts of those who survived the Whitaker home. Their testimonies, colored by trauma, fear, and the persistence of memory, promise to deepen the mystery further, blurring distinctions between fact and legend, between human psychology and forces beyond reason. The survivors of the Whitaker household emerged into a world irrevocably changed. The physical losses were harrowing enough. The deaths of Samuel and Clara left an emptiness that no amount of consolation could fill, but the psychological scars proved far more enduring. Those who remained recalled sleepless nights, a pervading sense of being watched, and inexplicable sounds emanating from the very bed that had claimed the lives of their siblings. Accounts from various family members and visitors converge in disturbing ways. Whispers of guttural voices, shadows flitting at edges of vision, and bedsheets that retained warmth long after the fires had been extinguished or windows opened to cold winter air. William Whitaker, the eldest surviving sibling at 12 years old, provided a particularly unsettling recollection. In interviews conducted decades later, he described awakening in his room to find himself paralyzed, unable to move a limb, while a voice, a low, guttural whisper, repeated his name in a cadence that seemed simultaneously alien and otherworldly. He claimed the experience lasted several minutes, though time felt stretched beyond comprehension. He attempted to call out, to summon his mother, but the sound caught in his throat. To William, the voice carried an intelligence, a deliberate awareness, as though the bed itself had selected him for some unfathomable purpose. Even in adulthood, he described recurring dreams in which the bed appeared at the center of a dark room, its slats creaking as though breathing, and its grain-forming glowing eyes that disappeared when he tried to focus on them. Visiting family members contributed additional layers to the mystery. Aunt Martha, a frequent visitor and caretaker during the Whitakers' absences in the cotton fields, wrote extensively in her journals. She recalled nights when the bed seemed to generate warmth of its own, even in the dead of winter. Her observations were meticulous. The sheets would feel hot to the touch, as if the mattress itself were alive. Once, she claimed, she attempted to lift the bedding to examine the mattress, only to find it impossibly heavy, resisting her efforts as though it were anchored by unseen forces. These accounts, at first dismissed by neighbors as exaggeration or eccentricity, gained credibility when cross-referenced with other family testimonies that described similar phenomena. The youngest surviving children, Emily and Thomas Whitaker, spoke of glowing eyes forming within the grain of the wooden bed frame. They insisted the eyes moved, tracking their every movement, vanishing instantly when touched or when the lights flickered on. Psychologists analyzing these accounts later suggested that children's imaginations, heightened by trauma and fear, might produce hallucinations consistent across multiple observers. Yet the children's depictions were detailed, consistent, and eerily synchronized. Their descriptions of movement, color, and timing defied simple explanation, inviting speculation that the house itself or some force within it interacted with perception in ways that modern science struggled to explain. Some survivors attributed the events to human cruelty rather than supernatural agency. William and Emily Occasionally friends, Reverend Elias Crow's reports of harsh discipline and psychological manipulation. They suggested that Thornton, a stern and sometimes frightening figure, may have exploited existing fears to reinforce control over the household. Letters indicate that he employed strict schedules, relentless chores, and verbal intimidation, all framed as spiritual guidance. Observers argue that such an environment could exacerbate sleep disorders, anxiety, and hallucinations. Yet even when the children acknowledged Thornton's human authority, they insisted that some experiences transcended his capacity for influence. The whispers, the glowing eyes, and the warmth of the bed appeared independent of his presence, suggesting either an extraordinary coincidence or something far more sinister. Accounts from neighbors and visitors further complicate interpretation. Mrs. Allen, who rented a room adjacent to the farmhouse, recalled a night when she awoke to hear faint, childlike laughter mingled with rasping murmurs. She peered through the window and observed shadows moving along the floorboards, seemingly coordinating with sounds emanating from the Whitaker bed. Attempts to replicate the acoustics or lighting conditions in later investigations failed to reproduce the phenomena. Similarly, local children who played in the yard at dusk reported fleeting glimpses of motion within the farmhouse windows, forms that resembled children but moved with unnatural fluidity. These reports, while anecdotal, reinforced the perception that the household's tragedies were not confined to the imagination of the family alone. The psychological dimensions of the survivors' testimonies reveal the complex interplay between trauma, memory, and myth. Recollections were often fragmented, colored by grief, and susceptible to reinterpretation over time. Emily, in letters composed years later, reflected on the intensity of fear that pervaded her earliest memories. I remember feeling eyes on me then, when alone, and though I now know it may have been the shadows, at the time, it was no shadow at all. Scholars studying such accounts emphasize that trauma can alter perception, creating experiences that feel undeniably real, even if they are constructed in response to fear. The Whitaker survivors' stories exemplify this dynamic. Every whispered sound and shifting shadow was embedded in a context of profound loss and anxiety, magnifying its significance. At the same time, the persistence of the accounts across decades complicates a purely psychological clan. William, Emily, and Thomas, when interviewed as adults, described experiences they had not previously discussed with each other, yet the core details remained consistent. The bedframe's unusual warmth, the sensation of being watched, the auditory phenomena, all repeated in ways that suggest either remarkable coincidence or the operation of forces not understood by contemporary science. These consistencies lent credibility to local folklore, which had long portrayed the Whitaker household as a locus of malevolent influence. Religious interpretations persisted Allen's psychological analysis. Reverend Crow's diaries detailed his ongoing efforts to cleanse the farmhouse. He wrote of nights when the children seemed frozen in place, responding to voices that were not his, and of whispers that mocked his prayers. Crow's failure to remove the perceived presence reinforced the notion that the Bed and the space surrounding it was an agent of its own, independent of human influence. Local parishioners debated whether the events were divine punishment, demonic interference, or evidence of a spiritual threshold in the region. For believers, the accounts of the surviving Whitakers provided both evidence and warning. Ordinary households could harbor extraordinary, terrifying forces. The tension between environmental, psychological, and spiritual explanations reaches its peak when considering collective perception. The survivors' experiences were deeply personal, yet their narrative esoverped in striking ways. Shadows moved at the same time as whispers, and sensations of warmth coincided with auditory phenomena. These intersections suggest a complex interplay between sensory perception, memory, and perhaps something more than mere coincidence. Anthropologists studying oral histories note that such phenomena are often interpreted as supernatural precisely because rational explanations fail to account for their intricacy and consistency. Even the most skeptical observers recognized the depth of the impact on the Whitaker family. Social historians have noted that survivors often exhibited behaviors consistent with long-term trauma, hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and a persistent fear of the farmhouse. Visitors who returned years later described an oppressive atmosphere, a weight and fear that defied explanation. The bed, removed from the family home only decades later, continued to inspire accounts of unexplained phenomena. Its reputation became legend, an object at once mundane and monstrous, embodying both the fragility of the human mind and the enduring fascination with forces beyond comprehension. In sum, the Whitaker servers' accounts embody a tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between trauma-shaped perception and the possibility of supernatural intrusion. Their experiences challenge the audience to question the nature of reality, the reliability of memory, and the boundaries between fear, imagination, and external influence. Each whisper, shadow, and sensation is a testament to both the vulnerability of children in the face of incomprehensible events and the persistence of mystery that refuses to be rationalized. The surviving narratives, rich in detail and emotion, lay the groundwork for the theories and myths that would envelop the Whitaker farmhouse in the decades to follow, ensuring that its story remains haunting, unresolved, and endlessly compelling. Over the decades, the tale of the Whitaker farmhouse and its so-called Whispering Bed of Beaumont transformed from a localized tragedy into a legend that spread far beyond the boundaries of the rural Texas town. Scholars, folklorists, psychologists, and occult enthusiasts have all grappled with the story, each interpreting the events through the lens of their respective disciplines, yet no consensus has ever been reached. The death of Samuel and Clara Whitaker, and the subsequent haunting accounts of the surviving family members, became a canvas upon which generations projected fear, morality, and imagination. The bed itself, once a mere object of domestic utility, assumed an almost sentient role in the collective consciousness, a symbol of the inexplicable and terrifying, capable of invoking dread simply by being mentioned. Historians, relying primarily on court documents, family correspondence, and newspaper accounts, often approach the story with a focus on negligence, environmental hazards, and possible illness. Some contend that the deaths could be traced to undiagnosed respiratory conditions exacerbated by poor ventilation, mold, or toxins present in the wooden structure of the home. They cite medical reports indicating respiratory distress in both Samuel and Clara, and they note that similar conditions were not uncommon in early 20th century rural households. The convergence of poverty, inadequate health care, and structural deficiencies offers a plausible, if unsatisfying, explanation. According to these interpretations, the whispers, glowing eyes, and warmth were psychological embellishments born of grief and fear. Yet even the historians concede that these rationalizations do not fully account for the consistency of repeated phenomena over multiple witnesses and decades, leaving a gap that rationality alone struggles to bridge. Psychologists, meanwhile, analyze the narrative through the framework of trauma, perception, and collective memory. The surviving Whitaker children were exposed to repeated loss and stress at formative ages. Scholars posit that hallucinations, sleep paralysis, and heightened suggestibility could explain many of the reported phenomena, from whispers in the night to visions of glowing eyes. In particular, the phenomenon of shared hallucination, where multiple individuals report overlapping sensory experiences under conditions of extreme stress, is invoked to explain the consistent accounts among siblings. Cognitive psychologists highlight the role of imagination and memory distortion when trauma is compounded with cultural narratives about evil and superstition. Even ordinary objects like a bed can be perceived as active agents of fear. Within this framework, the bed's malevolence is less a matter of supernatural interference and more a reflection of the human mind's capacity to shape reality in response to intense stress and unresolved grief. Yet rational and clinical interpretations coexist uneasily with occult theories. Among those who study folklore, esoteric practice, and supernatural phenomena, the bed is viewed as a vessel for dark forces. Some suggest that the wood itself was sourced from trees imbued with historical violence or ritualistic significance, possibly felled from lands once used by itinerant preachers known for violent purification ceremonies. Other theorists claim that hidden symbols, carved discreetly into slats and supports, acted as conduits for malevolent energy. Diaries and later sketches attributed to Reverend Crowe document these markings, though skeptics argue they were the product of imaginative embellishment or misinterpretation. Occultists contend that the bed acted as a focal point for spiritual or demonic forces, a physical anchor that allowed unseen entities to interact with the physical world. Communities in Beaumont and beyond quickly absorbed bed-theisy stories into local folklore. By the mid-20th century, the tale of the whispering bed had become a cautionary legend, passed from generation to generation. Storytellers often emphasized morality, warning that the bed's wrath targeted those who transgressed societal norms or who failed to honor ancestral obligations. Within these retellings, the line between fact and fiction blurred, creating an intricate tapestry of myth and memory. Witness accounts, oral histories, and creative elaborations merged, creating a story that was never entirely the same twice. The result was a narrative that served both as a vessel for cultural fears and as a symbolic reflection of human attempts to grapple with unexplainability. Religious interpretations also grew in influence. Reverend Crowe's failed attempts at exorcism became a focal point of discussion. Was his inability to remove the whispers evidence of the supremacy of evil over human intervention? Or did it simply illustrate the limitations of superstition in confronting psychological phenomena? Some adherents claimed divine judgment, asserting that the bed and its surrounding house were instruments of cosmic morality, meting out punishment for the sins of the Whitaker lineage, or for the broader community's failure to honor spiritual law. Others saw Crowe's failure as proof that malevolent forces could operate independently of human perception and intervention, a notion that perpetuated fear and heightened the bed's legendary status. The intertwining of religious narrative with folklore added another layer of complexity, ensuring that any attempt at a purely rational explanation was met with cultural and spiritual resistance. Debates also arose regarding the possible involvement of hidden human agents. Some theorists argued that a clandestine sect or cult, operating in secrecy, might have intentionally marked or manipulated Thebes to generate fear, perhaps as part of a cult ritual or moral experimentation. Proponents point to historical records of ignorant groups in the region who practiced esoteric rites, often on remote farmland, though direct evidence is scant. Yet these theories provide an alternative to both purely psychological and purely supernatural explanations, raising the possibility that malevolence, human or otherwise, could operate in tandem with environment and perception to create the horrifying phenomena reported. Cultural studies emphasize that the persistence of these Myths is less about the events themselves and more about the psychological and social functions they serve. Legends like the Whispering Bed allow communities to process collective trauma, explore moral boundaries, and negotiate fear in controlled ways. For storytelling, the community could externalize uncertainty, projecting fears onto a tangible object, the bed rather than confronting the more diffuse, unsettling realities of illness, accident, and mortality. Folklore theorists note that in many societies, stories of haunted objects or cursed spaces emerge precisely when ordinary explanations fail to satisfy human curiosity or emotional need. In this context, the bed's legend becomes as much a mirror of human psychology as it is a chronicle of actual events. The tension between science and superstition, reason and myth, persists in modern examinations. Documentarians, paranormal investigators, and academic researchers continue to return to the Whitaker story, each bringing a distinct methodology. Some conduct environmental analyses, measuring humidity, wood density, and historical records of health and sanitation. Others employ audio and visual monitoring in search of anomalies instant with historical accounts. Meanwhile, folklorists and occultists interpret historical records, sketches, and testimonies through symbolic and esoteric lenses. Each approach offers insight, yet none resolves the essential question: was the bed itself imbued with malevolence, or did the legend grow in response to trauma, fear, and imagination? Even today, the bed occupies a unique place in public consciousness. Exhibitions, documentaries, and online discussions perpetuate the mystery, inviting new audiences to speculate. Its legacy illustrates the human need to confront incompetence tragedy through narrative, to create patterns where chaos seems to reign, and to explore moral, psychological, and supernatural dimensions simultaneously. Whether interpreted as evidence of occult power, the product of collective trauma, or a cautionary tale of historical neglect, the bed functions as a focal point for enduring curiosity and fear. Ultimately, the various theories and myths surrounding the Whitaker farmhouse and the Whispering Bed reveal as much about the observers as the observed. They expose the fragility of human understanding, the interplay between trauma and imagination, and the capacity of objects to assume meaning far beyond their mundane function. Each explanation, rational, psychological, religious, or supernatural, offers a lens through which to view human anxiety, ethical questions, and the pursuit of knowledge in the face of the unexplainable. The bed's legend and the myths that surround it continue to thrive precisely because the story remains unresolved. No single account can definitively explain the whispers, the warmth, or the glowing eyes. No scientific report, diary, or exorcism has conclusively settled the debate. In this ambiguity, the Whispering Bed exerts a lasting power, haunting both those who experienced it firsthand and generations who encounter its story secondhand. Scholars, skeptics, and believers alike are drawn into its orbit, each compelled to interpret, analyze, and speculate, ensuring that the legend persists in perpetuity. In this tangled web of fact, fiction, and perception, the bed transcends its physicality. It embodies the tension between human understanding and the unknowable, between psychology and the supernatural, and between morality and fear. The debates surrounding it, whether scientific, folkloric, or theological, reflect humanity's perennial struggle to reconcile the ordinary with the extraordinary. The bed's story is, ultimately, an enduring invitation to question, to explore, and to confront the limits of comprehension. The theories and myths that surround it remain unresolved, leaving observers unsettled, haunted, and fascinated, compelled to revisit the story repeatedly, each time searching for a truth that may forever lie just beyond reach. The tale of the Whitaker farmhouse and its so-called Whispering Bed of Beaumont does not conclude neatly, nor does it offer closure. Decades of speculation, investigation, and storytelling have only deepened its mystery, ensuring that Thebes remains both object and symbol, a vessel of unease, a mirror of human fear. Even today, those who study it grapple with fundamental questions. Was this tragedy purely the product of environmental neglect and medical misfortune, a convergence of human error and misdiagnosis? Or did something far more sinister, perhaps supernatural or psychological, imbue the wooden frame with a life beyond comprehension? Every theory illuminates a facet of the story, yet none can claim absolute truth, leaving an enduring space where dread and curiosity intersect. The deaths of Samuel and Clara Whitaker and the memories of those who survived remain hauntingly unresolved, a riddle that challenged both reason and imagination. Psychologists continue to explore the influence of trauma, fear, and shared hallucinations in the Whitaker family. The patterns of behavior, the whispered warnings, the perceptions of warmth and glowing eyes, each can be interpreted as a response to extreme stress and collective grief. Yet the consistency of accounts over years, across multiple witnesses, resists simple rationalization. How does one reconcile the apparent independence of these phenomena from objective conditions? Were these children and adults shaping reality itself through the intensity of their terror? Or was there an external force bending the fabric of perception around them? Each unanswered question reinforces uneasy tension between skepticism and belief, leaving the audience suspended in ambiguity. Simultaneously, religious interpretations persist. Some claim divine judgment or cosmic retribution, suggesting that the bed was an instrument of moral consequence, meting out punishment for hidden transgressions or ancestral sins. Reverend Krauss' failed exorcisms remain a focal point for debate. Did they fail because of human limitation, or because they confront forces beyond human comprehension? The intertwining of morality, religion, and superstition ensures that the story cannot be neatly explained, and that each retelling carries the weight of ethical and spiritual consideration. Alongside fear, occult theorists and folklorists offer yet another dimension. The bed, imbued with whispered curses, ritualistic carvings, or residual energy from violent histories, embodies humanity's fascination with the unseen. Legends thrive precisely as the inexplicable persists. Every shadow, every story passed from neighbor to neighbor, every documented diary entry adds layers to a myth that refuses finality. The bed becomes a canvas on which human imagination, anxiety, and moral reflection are projected, an enduring symbol of both fear and fascination. Ultimately, the whispering bed is a testament to ambiguity itself. It is a story of innocence corrupted, of fear given form, and of reality refracted throughout Roma, superstition, and speculation. The debates it ignites, scientific, psychological, theological, and folkloric, remain unresolved, compelling each observer to question the nature of evil, the limits of understanding, and the line between perception and reality. Perhaps the truth perished with the Whitakers, or perhaps it lingers still, whispering through the grain of a bed, waiting for those who dare to listen. In this uncertainty lies its enduring power. The bed doesn't merely haunt a house. It haunts the mind, leaving a shadow of doubt and fascination that refuses to be exorcised, ensuring the legend endures for generations yet to come.